The steel of the shovel blade rang a single clear note each time it struck a stone in the dense, clay-rich soil. Elias worked with a rhythm that was not his own, but the earth's. It was a slow, stubborn cadence of dig, lift, and toss, one that had been set by generations of hard seasons in this high valley. The late August sun beat down on his shoulders, but the trench he was carving was already cool, smelling of damp rock and deep thyme. It snaked away from the foundation of his small cabin, a raw, red wound in the green meadow. Beside the growing mound of displaced earth, a large, brindle dog with intelligent amber eyes lay with his head on his paws, watching every movement. The dog, Boulder, would occasionally lift his head, ears perked, at the sound of a distant hawk, but his attention always returned to the boy and the trench. He was a silent, patient witness to the undertaking. Elias paused, leaning on the worn hickory handle of the shovel, and wiped a sleeve across his brow. He was 17, lean and wiry, with hands that already looked older than the rest of him. The cabin, built by his grandfather and maintained by his father, was his now. Everything was his. The 30 acres of timber and meadow, the cold, clear creek, the view of the granite peaks, and the crushing weight of the coming winter. He had his father's journals, filled with meticulous script, strange diagrams and calculations that defied the simple logic of the valley. It was from one of those diagrams that this trench was born. A plan for a stove that was not a stove, a hearth that lived beneath the floorboards. An earth lung, his father had called it. A voice, rough as granite, pulled him from his thoughts. "What in God's name are you digging, boy? A grave for a giant?" Elias looked up. Mr. Gable stood at the edge of the property, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of weathered skepticism. He was the valley's oldest resident, a man who had seen 70 winters and believed he understood all their tricks. He measured a man by the height of his woodpile, and Elias had not even begun to stack his. Elias drove the shovel into the earth again before answering. "A new stove." Gable squinted, his gaze following the inexplicable path of the trench. It ran from the cabin's main room, branched into 2 smaller channels, looped around in a wide serpentine pattern under where the floor would be, and returned to the base of the chimney. "A stove? That's a ditch, Elias. Stoves are made of iron and sit in the corner of a room. They eat wood and they throw heat. I've had the same model for 40 years. It works." "This will be different," Elias said, his voice quiet. He did not like to argue. The journals did not argue. They simply stated facts of heat and mass and time. "Different isn't always better," Gable grunted, stepping closer. "You're undermining your own foundation. You've got no one to tell you otherwise now, but your father, bless his soul, he knew how to stack a cord of wood. He wouldn't be wasting the last good weeks of summer digging holes. Wait until the ground freezes. That whole trench will heave and crack your floor in 2. He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and condemnation. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." Elias just nodded, his gaze fixed on the next shovelful of dirt. "I have a plan." "A plan," Gable scoffed, turning to leave. "Plans don't keep you from freezing when it's 30 below. Wood does. You'd be wise to remember that." He walked away, his heavy boots crushing the meadow grass, leaving Elias alone with the ringing of the shovel and the patient silence of his dog. That evening, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Elias sat at the simple pine table his father had built. Boulder rested his heavy head on Elias's knee. The journal was open to a page of intricate drawings. It showed a cross-section of the cabin, a deep firebox sunk into the earth, connected to a long, winding flue made of stone and clay, a thermal labyrinth that would snake under the floor. The smoke and hot gases, instead of rushing straight up a chimney, would be forced to travel nearly 60 feet horizontally, their heat slowly bleeding into a massive bed of sand, stone, and earth packed around the channels. The floor itself would become the radiator. "The earth is a battery for heat," his father had written. "A conventional stove warms the air. This warms the mass. It is the difference between a shout and a long, slow hum." Elias traced the lines with a calloused finger. The logic of it felt clean and right, a secret whispered from the earth itself. He looked at Boulder, whose tail gave a slight, trusting thump against the wooden floor. It would work. He knew it would. He just had to build it. The work shifted from digging to hauling. For 2 weeks, from dawn until the last light failed, Elias made the journey to the creek bed a mile away. He used a heavy wooden wheelbarrow his grandfather had built, its single iron wheel groaning under the strain. He was searching for the right stones, flat, dense, granite and schist, worn smooth by 1,000 years of rushing water. Each one had to be lifted, tested for weight and size, and loaded. The journey back was a slow, grueling climb, his muscles screaming with every push. He stacked the stones near the trench, a growing gray cairn that represented hundreds of trips and thousands of pounds of rock. Boulder always accompanied him, trotting ahead on the path and waiting patiently as Elias wrestled another stone from the creek's grasp. One afternoon, his hand slipped while prying a particularly large, flat stone from the bank. Its sharp edge sliced a deep 3-inch gash across his palm. Blood welled instantly, dripping onto the pale gray of the rock. He swore, a sharp, quiet sound that was immediately swallowed by the murmur of the creek. He sat down heavily on the bank, wrapping the wound tightly with his handkerchief. Boulder came over and nudged his arm, whining softly. Elias stroked the dog's head with his good hand. "It's all right, boy. Just a cut." He sat there for a long time, the pain a dull throb, and watched the water flow over the rocks. It was a reminder of the cost of the work, a small payment in blood for the shelter he was trying to build. Back at the cabin, he cleaned the wound with whiskey, the sting making him gasp, and stitched it closed himself with a fine needle and thread, just as his mother had taught him. His hands trembled, but the stitches were small and even. The next day he was back at the creek, his bandaged hand aching, but his resolve untouched. He learned to lift with his legs, to use leverage, to read the grain of a rock before trying to split it. His body hardened, the soft parts of him worn away by the labor. He became an extension of the tools he used, a living piece of the process. Mrs. Finch, who lived on the next homestead down the valley, stopped by one afternoon. She was a kind woman with worried eyes, who had taken it upon herself to check on him since his parents' passing. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle, "Mr. Gable says you're tearing up your house." "I'm improving it," he replied, carefully setting a heavy capstone onto a section of the trench wall. The stone fit perfectly, locking into place with a satisfying grind. She looked at his bandaged hand, at the sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, at the sheer, overwhelming scale of the project. "You're working too hard. You'll wear yourself out before the snow flies, and you're getting thin." She uncovered the basket, revealing a loaf of fresh bread, a crock of butter, and a small roasted chicken. "You need to eat." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," he said, genuinely grateful. He accepted the food, but he knew her kindness was laced with the same doubt that colored all his neighbors' views. They saw a grieving, stubborn boy engaged in a foolish, monumental task. They saw him trying to fight a mountain with a shovel. They didn't see the elegant physics in his father's journal. They didn't feel the certainty that hummed in his own bones. He began the slow, meticulous work of lining the trenches. He laid a base of sand, then began fitting the flat stones into walls, creating the channels that would carry the heat. It was like building a buried river. Each stone was chosen, turned, and placed, sometimes a dozen times, until it sat perfectly against its neighbors. He used no mortar on the bottom sections, allowing for drainage, but for the sidewalls and the capstones, he would need something to seal the flue. That was the next stage, the lungs of clay. As September bled into October, the aspen groves on the high slopes turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decay. The days shortened, and a new urgency entered Elias's work. He spent a week digging clay from a deposit near the creek, hauling it back in buckets. He mixed it with sand and water, stomping it with his bare feet in a shallow pit until it had the consistency of thick dough. It was cold, messy, exhausting work. His feet were caked in gray mud from dawn to dusk. Boulder would watch from a safe distance, occasionally sneezing as dust from the dry sand filled the air. This clay mortar was for sealing the capstones of the flue. Every seam had to be perfect. A leak would mean smoke in the cabin, or worse, a fire hazard. He worked by feel, his fingers learning the language of the clay, pushing it into the smallest crevices, smoothing it with a wet piece of wood. He was creating a sealed, 60-foot-long artery of stone, buried a foot beneath his floorboards. He stopped at the general store in the small village 5 miles down the valley to buy a cast-iron door for the firebox and several lengths of stovepipe. Mr. Harris, the proprietor, a man whose wealth was built on selling necessities at a premium, watched him load the items onto his wagon. "Building a new stove, Elias?" Harris asked, though he already knew the answer. News, especially of the strange variety, traveled fast in the valley. "Something like it," Elias said. Harris leaned against a barrel, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Heard it's mostly underground. Gable says you're one good frost heave away from disaster. I hope you've got enough money set aside to buy a real stove from me when that contraption of yours fails in the middle of January." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "I'll even give you a small discount. Call it a lesson fee." Elias finished tying down the pipe and looked at the man. He felt no anger, only a weary sense of distance. They were speaking different languages. Harris spoke the language of commerce and convention. Elias was learning the language of thermal mass. "This will work," he said, his voice flat and certain. He clicked the reins and the old horse pulled the wagon away, leaving Mr. Harris shaking his head. The firebox was the heart of the system. He dug the pit for it 3 feet deep inside the cabin, lining it with the thickest stones and a double layer of clay. He built an insulated ash pit below and set the iron door into the stone face. From the back of this firebox, the main flue began its long, winding journey. The chimney was the final piece. He carefully dismantled the existing chimney down to the floor level, cleaning each brick. He rebuilt it, integrating the inlet from the flue system at its base. The smoke would enter the chimney only after its long, slow journey under the floor, stripped of most of its heat. It would be a cool, lazy smoke, not the hot, wasteful plume of a conventional fire. He finished the last clay seal on the day the first snow fell. They were just flurries, tiny white specks melting as they touched the ground, but they were a promise of what was to come, a warning. He worked faster, backfilling the trenches with sand, a painstaking process of pouring and tamping to ensure there were no air pockets. The sand would hold and distribute the heat. He laid new floorboards over the top, thick planks of pine he had milled himself the previous spring. When he was done, the room looked almost the same as it had before, except for the low brick face of the firebox set against the wall. There was no sign of the massive stone and clay structure that now slept beneath the floor. That night, the temperature dropped. A skim of ice formed on the water bucket. Elias stood in the center of the room, his boots on the new floorboards. The house was cold, colder than it had ever been. It was an empty vessel, waiting to be filled. Boulder whined softly, pressing against his leg, shivering. Elias looked at the iron door of the firebox. All the theory, all the labor, all the doubt and ridicule of the past 2 months came down to this moment. He had stacked a small amount of wood, just enough for the first few weeks. He had followed his father's diagrams to the letter. Now, it was time to see if the hum was real. He knelt and opened the heavy iron door. The inside of the firebox was a dark, cavernous space. He laid a bed of dry kindling, then a few pieces of seasoned birch. His hands were steady. He struck a match, the flare of it unnaturally bright in the dim cabin. He touched it to the kindling. A small flame flickered, caught, and grew, its light dancing on the stone walls of the fire chamber. He closed the door, leaving the draft vent open just a crack. He put his hand on the stovepipe rising from the firebox. It grew warm, then hot. He moved to the chimney base across the room. He waited. 1 minute. 2. He felt a faint warmth begin to radiate from the bricks. The draw was working. The smoke was on its journey. He laid his hand flat on the wooden floorboards directly above the main flue, a few feet from the firebox. Nothing. It was as cold as the air in the room. He waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. He thought of Gable's words, of Harris's smirk. He had spent his entire summer on a madman's dream. Perhaps they were right. Boulder, sensing his anxiety, came and sat beside him, resting his head on his master's thigh. Elias stayed there for an hour, feeding small pieces of wood into the fire every 20 minutes. The firebox was drawing well, burning clean and hot. The chimney remained just barely warm. The floor remained cold. A knot of disappointment tightened in his stomach. He had failed. He had spent his strength and his time on a folly, and now winter was at the door. He stood up, his joints stiff. He walked across the room to bank the fire for the night, his boots heavy on the cold planks. And then he felt it. A spot, no bigger than a dinner plate, a few feet from the far wall. It was a subtle thing, easily missed, a patch of floor that was not cold. It was not warm, not yet, but the bitter chill was gone from it. He knelt and pressed his palm against the wood. A faint, deep-seated warmth was rising from below. It was the hum. The long, slow hum his father had written about. He moved back across the floor, tracing the path of the buried flue with his hands. Here and there he could feel it, the faintest whisper of heat beginning to saturate the mass of sand and stone. It had taken almost 2 hours for the first of the heat to travel the full 60-foot length of the system. It was working. It was just slow. Incredibly, wonderfully slow. A grin spread across Elias's face, the first true grin he'd felt in months. He let out a low laugh. Boulder, startled, looked up at him. Then, seeing his master's joy, his tail began to thump a happy rhythm on the floor. Elias lay down on his stomach, pressing his cheek to the boards. The warmth was real. It was a quiet, steady promise. He fell asleep right there, on the floor of his strange new home, while the first real snow of winter began to fall outside, blanketing the valley in a deep and silent white. For the next 2 weeks, the weather was deceptively mild for November, a false spring before the deep freeze. Elias tended his fire with a new understanding. The earth stove was not a sprint, it was a marathon. It required a small, hot fire for a few hours in the morning and a few in the evening. The immense thermal mass under the house would absorb the heat and then radiate it back slowly, consistently, over the next 12 hours. The cabin settled into a state of gentle, even warmth. There were no hot spots near a roaring stove, no cold corners. The entire floor became a single, massive, lukewarm radiator. The air didn't feel hot. The building itself felt alive. Boulder abandoned his rug by the old hearth and took to sprawling out in the middle of the room, soaking in the ambient heat. The valley, however, did not forget its skepticism. Mr. Gable, seeing only a thin trickle of smoke from Elias's chimney, stopped by one morning. "Having trouble keeping your fire lit, boy?" he asked, a knowing look in his eye. "That's what happens when you try to reinvent the chimney. Doesn't draw right." "It's drawing fine," Elias said, stepping out onto his porch. The air was cold, but he wore only a light shirt. Gable was bundled in a heavy wool coat. Gable eyed his lack of attire. "You'll catch your death. Pride won't keep you warm." He gestured with his chin toward Elias's meager woodpile. "That won't last you through Christmas. My pile is twice that, and I'm worried." He shook his head and walked on, convinced he was witnessing the prelude to a tragedy born of youthful arrogance. The tragedy, however, was not destined for Elias's door. It arrived in the second week of December, riding in on a wind from the north that felt like it was scraped from the surface of a dead star. The old-timers called it a white hurricane. The temperature didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. From a brisk 20 degrees, it plummeted to 0, then 10 below, then 20. The wind howled, picking up the accumulated snow and turning the world into a churning, blinding chaos of white. The radio announced it was the worst Arctic front in a generation. Inside his cabin, Elias felt the change. The floor, which had been pleasantly warm, cooled slightly. He fed the firebox more wood, keeping a hotter, steadier fire than before. The thermal battery he had built drank the extra heat greedily. The floor stabilized, returning to its gentle, radiating warmth. The windows frosted over at the edges, but the air inside remained a constant, comfortable 65 degrees. He and Boulder sat in the quiet warmth, listening to the storm rage outside. The sound of the wind was a distant, frustrated thing, a beast locked out of the house. By the third day of the storm, the temperature had dropped to 45 degrees below zero. The wind was a physical force, shaking the walls of even the sturdiest homes. In the village, water pipes froze and burst. The power lines, heavy with ice, snapped, plunging the valley into darkness and deeper cold. The radio went silent. For the families in the valley, it became a primal struggle. Their iron stoves, which had always been enough, were now ravenous. They devoured wood at an incredible rate, yet could only heat a small circle of air around them. The rest of the houses were dangerously, life-threateningly cold. People huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding their precious wood into the fire, watching it turn to heat that was immediately stolen by the walls and whipped away by the wind. The first knock on Elias's door came late on the fourth night. It was a faint, desperate tapping, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Elias opened it to find Mr. and Mrs. Finch and their two small children, all four of them wrapped in coats and blankets, their faces pale and pinched with cold. Snow was caked in their eyebrows and hair. "Elias," Mrs. Finch stammered, her teeth chattering. "Our wood, we're almost out. The house it's colder inside than it is out, I swear. Can we just warm up for a little while?" Elias said nothing. He simply stepped back and held the door wide. They shuffled in, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had been expecting a single overheated room. Instead, they walked into a space that felt normal. The air was fresh and evenly warm. There was no roaring stove, only the quiet brick face of the firebox. "Take off your coats," Elias said quietly. "You'll be too hot." Mrs. Finch's son, a boy of 6, let his mother unwind the scarf from his face, and then, hesitantly, he sat down on the floor. His eyes went wide. "Mama," he whispered, pressing his hands to the wooden planks. "The floor is warm." Mrs. Finch knelt and touched it herself. She looked up at Elias, her worried eyes now filled with a dawning wonder that bordered on reverence. She opened her mouth to say something, to ask how, but no words came. She simply shook her head in amazement. Elias took their frozen coats and hung them on pegs, where they began to drip onto the warm floor, the water hissing faintly as it evaporated. He served them hot soup, and they ate in a silence broken only by the storm outside and the quiet crackle of the fire in the earth. An hour later there was another knock, this one louder, more forceful. It was Gable. He looked broken. His proud, skeptical face was haggard, his beard flecked with ice. He did not look at Elias, but at the Finch family, sitting comfortably in their shirt sleeves. "My fire went out," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Can't get it started again. The chimney's frozen. My last cord of wood is buried under a 6-foot drift." He finally raised his eyes to meet Elias's. All the mockery was gone, replaced by a raw, humble desperation. "I was wrong, boy. I was a fool." "There's room," Elias said and stepped aside. Gable entered, his big frame seeming to shrink as he absorbed the impossible warmth. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, turning in a slow circle. He ran his hand over the smooth, warm floorboards. He looked at the simple firebox, then at the chimney on the opposite wall. He was connecting the pieces, the full, radical genius of the design finally crashing down on him. It works," he breathed. "It actually works." By morning, half the valley was in Elias's cabin. The Harris family came, their fine clothes seeming out of place, their condescension replaced by shivering gratitude. Others followed, families and single old-timers, a slow pilgrimage of the cold seeking warmth. Elias's home, the subject of so much ridicule, had become an ark. The space was crowded, but no one complained. They sat on the floor, a sprawling mass of humanity, soaking in the gentle, life-giving heat that rose from the earth. They shared stories, shared food, and shared a profound communal sense of awe. They looked at the quiet boy who had built it all, the boy they had called insane, and they saw a savior. Elias moved among them, tending the fire, ensuring everyone was comfortable, speaking little, his actions saying everything that needed to be said. He had not built a stove, he had built a sanctuary. The great storm broke on the 7th day. The wind died, the snow stopped, and a weak, watery sun appeared in a sky of washed-out blue. The temperature slowly, grudgingly, began to climb. The valley looked like a new world, scoured and reshaped by the ice and wind. One by one, the families left Elias's cabin, returning to their own cold, damaged homes. But they were not the same people who had arrived. They carried with them the memory of the warm floor and the quiet boy who had defied a winter that should have killed them. The thaw was more than just meteorological. A deep-seated skepticism in the valley's soul had been broken. The old ways, the ways of the iron stove and the massive woodpile, had been revealed as brittle and insufficient. In their place was a new, quiet truth radiating from the floor of Elias's cabin. That spring, Mr. Gable was the first to approach him, his hat in his hands. "Elias," he said, his voice thick with humility, "I need you to teach me. I need you to show me what's in that book of your father's." Elias simply nodded and brought out the journal. They sat together at the pine table, the old man who thought he knew everything and the young man who knew how to listen to the earth. Elias pointed to the diagrams, explaining the principles of thermal mass, of the slow burn, of capturing every last calorie of heat before letting the smoke escape. Gable listened, his brow furrowed in concentration, tracing the lines with a gnarled finger. He was not the only one. Soon, others came. Mr. Harris arrived, not with condescension, but with an offer to fund the purchase of materials for anyone who wanted to build an earth stove, calling it an investment in the community. Mrs. Finch organized the women to provide food and support for the building crews. The valley spent that summer not in isolated competition for resources, but in communal cooperation. Elias, once the quiet outcast, became the reluctant teacher. He never boasted, never said, "I told you so." He just shared the knowledge, walking from homestead to homestead, advising on trench depths, on the right mix for clay mortar, on the proper way to lay the flue stones. He taught them to read the land, to find the clay and the stone, to build with what was already there. By the time the snows returned, 3 more cabins in the valley were warmed by the slow, steady hum of an earth lung. The next year, there were 7. The knowledge spread, passed from neighbor to neighbor. Each new stove a slight variation on the last, adapted and improved. The wood piles in the valley shrank, but the homes were warmer, safer. The community itself had been reforged in the cold, made stronger and more resilient by the insane idea of a quiet boy. Years passed. The seasons turned, each winter a little less fearsome than the last. Elias lived his life in the cabin, the steady warmth of the floor a constant companion. Boulder grew old, his brindle coat silvering at the muzzle. He spent his final years sleeping in his favorite spot in the center of the room. One winter morning, Elias woke to find him still, his great heart having quietly given out in his sleep. He had died in a warm house, comfortable and at peace. Elias carried his old friend out and buried him on the hill overlooking the cabin, under a tall pine tree. He carved the dog's name into a flat stone to mark the spot. The grief was a cold, hollow space inside him, but the warmth of the house was a comfort, a testament to the life of labor they had shared. Elias himself grew older. His hands, once merely calloused, became gnarled with arthritis, but they still knew the feel of stone and wood. He never married, but he was never alone. He was the quiet center of the community he had saved, the keeper of the knowledge. Young builders and newly married couples would come to his door to look at the journal, which was now worn and soft with use. He would let them study it, answering their questions in his usual short, declarative sentences, his eyes holding a patient wisdom. He lived to see the valley transformed. The cabins, new and old, were all warmed by versions of his father's design. The air in winter was cleaner, with less wood smoke hanging in the cold, still air. The people were more self-sufficient, their fear of the cold replaced by a quiet confidence. One day, in his 78th year, when a young woman came to ask about the angle of a firebox throat, he simply gave her the journal. "It's yours now," he said. "Keep it safe. Share it." He died a few years later, as peacefully as his old dog had, sitting in his chair by the firebox, the gentle heat rising from the floorboards he had laid so long ago. The entire valley turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the hill next to Boulder. They did not commission a fancy headstone from the city. Instead, Mr. Gable's grandson, a master stonemason, found a large, flat piece of granite from the same creek bed where Elias had gathered his first stones. On it, he carved a simple epitaph: Elias Thorne. He taught us how to listen to the earth. Long after he was gone, the cabin stood. It became a landmark, a sort of historical trust for the valley. Travelers and descendants would visit, marveling at the simplicity and genius of it. They would enter, even on the coldest winter day, and be greeted by the gentle, welcoming warmth. They would place their hands on the floorboards and feel the slow, steady hum rising from the stone and clay below. A quiet, enduring legacy of the boy who built a stove that everyone called insane. It was the warmth of persistence. It was the heat of a well-kept promise.